The weekly Industry Angel podcast hears from business leaders and entrepreneurs who share their stories and that all-important light bulb moment. This can inspire us all and maybe scratch that itch and kickstart that idea that keeps you awake at night. And we are back. Welcome to episode 59 of the Industry Angel. A cheeky week's break for me last week with the family. We went off to the beautiful Lake District, hiking, sailing, swimming, eating lots of food and testing lots of real ale. So I'm back now. I'm going to have to work off those calories. But had a fantastic vacation and I hope you guys did too. If you're still there, remember, recharge the batteries, relax the diet. You come back stronger. And by definition, a break. It's a time to unwind, clear the mind, spend time with your loved ones. And the pressure we'll put ourselves under, it can be hard. And I certainly struggle sometimes to be actually present, even when I'm in the room. So don't feel guilty. It's not productive to keep pushing. So chill out, join the downtime party. Let's have a group hug, everyone. Get in. Right. What have I got? Shout outs. I got too excited there. Didn't have the group hug. Shout outs. Richard Young, thanks for your kind words on Twitter. Really pleased you found the show. Also, Gavin Forster. These guys are on a binge fest trying to catch up from episode 1. So, perfect for your vacation. Enjoy it, guys. Brooke Craven and also Cara F13 from the US. Thanks for your iTunes review. Really, really helps. Trevor15 from the UK, he also reviewed the show and loves the vibe. So thanks for that, Trevor. Incidentally, if you do leave a review on iTunes, please take a screenshot and tweet me it or email so I can thank you personally, as they can kind of get lost because each iTunes store, they have their own country store. So sometimes I'm not really checking out the tens and tens of countries that there is. So remember to keep in touch. Twitter is Ian_Farrer. Okay, let's get on to today's guest. Today we have author and expert in business idea validation, Luke Szyrmer. Welcome to the Industry Angel, Luke.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian.
So this is a subject close to my heart, Luke. So I do a little bit of lean and business model canvassing, business modeling with my clients. So I was really interested to get you on today. From a real expert. So you've wrote about this, you've wrote blogs about this. No pressure, my friend, but you're the expert, okay? So if we can wind this back, how did you come across this whole concept? Luke, what's your background?
So the way I came across it was I tried to launch a business and realized after I spent a few tens of thousands of dollars building out a product aimed at the financial sector, that it turned out there was pretty much no demand for what it is that I just built. And this was close to about 10 years ago now. And since then, at some point, I discovered basically the whole lean startup movement, which for me was a complete eye opener, and it basically focuses on removing waste from that initial process, and that initial process of starting a business and figuring out what it is that you need to build. And the reason why this is actually such a big deal is that the most common reason that startups fail still is basically that a product is built for a market that doesn't exist. And there's a whole series of different idea validation techniques which you can use to figure out whether or not it's worth pursuing a particular direction. And that's been my main area of interest and passion for quite a few years now at this point.
So what you're saying is that some startups fail because they create the kind of perfect model that nobody wants. There's no product to market fit there. And do you think they get a little bit wedded to it and a bit romantic about the whole thing?
So I think at some level this is a very kind of human issue. I mean, it's you have an idea, you're really passionate about it, you're going in a certain direction, but it's almost like you don't, if you don't actively seek out feedback, it's very difficult to know if you're going in the right direction. And the thing is, if you don't actively seek out feedback for a long period of time, you could just be completely going off course. And yeah, so basically with lean startup and with these idea validation techniques, the idea is that you want to be getting feedback from not just the market in general, but from the specific group of people that you think this product is ideal for. So, and the best way to do that initially is not build anything at all, but go and basically try and speak with them, try to interview them, try to find out more about them, find out about what it is they might need. And quite often, what happens is that you learn a huge amount, and reality is very different from what you think it is. So, I mean, I guess the best example of that is, I've organized a couple of Lean Startup Machine weekends in London, which basically is a weekend where we get together kind of 50 to 70 different entrepreneurs, and over that weekend, they all go out in teams and they try to kind of validate a particular idea that one of them is working on. Each team is. And what's amazing is that from that initial pitch, when the teams are forming, to how the idea looks kind of at the end, I mean, 80% of the teams are actually working on a very different concept by the end of that weekend. Just because they'd actually gone out and spoken to potential customers. So, they didn't need to build anything. They just went out, tried to engage with the market at this very raw level. And it's a very powerful and a very fast and a very effective way to make sure you're actually going in the right direction.
So in terms of those tests and in terms of getting those results, there's no need to kind of build the MVP first. It's just going out there and try to validate. Is that all right?
Yeah, so essentially, you want to be thinking in terms of tests right from the beginning. So so you go out, you speak with people, as soon as you possibly can, start thinking in terms of, well, okay, so if I speak to 10 people that exactly fit the criteria of the type of person that I want to be creating this product for, I expect that 40% of them are going to say that this is their biggest need, for example. So you can start doing tests, without having any kind of a product, any kind of, without pretty much anything else. And this is something that is definitely a very good idea to do at first, because it just really speeds up your whole learning process, in terms of just getting going and making sure you're going in the right direction.
I guess it stops with any assumptions. Quite often when you're building a product or a company, you're assuming a hell of a lot. And I guess from the software world, this would help shape functionality as well in certain features that you might want to build into the system when you've actually got those results back, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, this is a lot of this is just about data. So you go out and you have assumptions. And as long as you acknowledge that you're assuming a number of things, if you go out and you get data to prove or disprove what it is that you think is true, that really helps shape the product as you're building it, certainly in the software case. But I mean, Lean can be used in basically any kind of business as a set of techniques. It's just that it tends to be more useful in the case of businesses where you're dealing with a lot of significant unknowns, such as high tech, such as, biotech, such as things where you're really pushing the envelope or creating a completely new kind of product. So, for example, it wouldn't be that relevant for somebody who's trying to start like a pizza place or a hair salon. I mean, you certainly could do a lot of this stuff, but in that particular case, you're starting a business it's more or less a known business model, and you're just executing on that model.
Yeah, so we're looking at companies that are innovating quite a lot, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm really intrigued. You mentioned your software startup, and thinking from a listener's point of view, how long did you give it, Luke, before you sort of decided that it wasn't going to work, or that it wasn't actually going to float?
I think all in all, I mean, it depends on exactly where the starting point was, but it was
Okay.
about a year and a half. And the thing is, the more I got into all of this, I realized that actually that's more common than you would think. That it's just very easy to get caught up in this kind of thing. And then when now that I'm going out and helping startups and larger companies use these techniques, it's still surprising that they often. So quite a common scenario is they come to me, they have lots and lots of different ideas, they're pulled in all kinds of different directions, lots of things they could be doing. So they've basically been brainstorming, they've been doing all kinds of things, but they aren't quite as focused. When you take these kind of, certainly the evaluative tool set within, let's say, Lean Startup, then pretty quickly you get down to like the one or two or maybe three things that are actually going to move the needle. And that's that level of clarity is basically what you're after, where you really want to be identifying kind of the top thing you want to go after, and not be spending time or money or whatever on all of this other stuff, at least until you have that first thing working up and running.
I totally agree. And I like doing this with established businesses. Certainly around the value proposition canvas, we've really, what's the jobs to be done, put ourselves in the customer's shoes. Because what you find is that a lot of the marketing spend, a lot of the sales collateral they have is really not fit for purpose. It's quite often about the product, as opposed to actually the kind of benefits that the customer would like to achieve from buying that value prop. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's another one of these things where it's just hard to see outside of your own view of the world. And certainly as companies get larger, it's just more and more the issue of how they deliver their product and what their product is becomes kind of center stage for them. And it's just a temptation to start losing touch with what's actually going on with the market, where the needs are, who actually needs this, why they need it, what they need it for. And then in that context, certainly these lean startup techniques are quite useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this, as I say, this lean startup techniques isn't just for startups. I think it's for established businesses. And at any stage, really, it's always good to validate. And I think, do you use validation cards, Luke, in your coaching role?
So, yeah. So, I mean, certainly there's the validation cards that Alex Osterwalder has over at Strategizer. The tool that I like using, there's a bunch of guys out in San Francisco called Tricro, and they have a experiment template. So basically, it prints out in an A4. And it's basically the best tool to be able to formulate an experiment before you go out and run it, and then that holds you accountable after you run it. You know exactly what it is you thought was going to happen, and then you compare that to what actually happened. And then in that sense, it structures it a bit more, because you can't change what you thought was going to happen after it's already happened, and you can basically validate it that way after you've actually got data as to what's going on. And yeah, I mean, going back to your point that this isn't only for early stage and for startups. I mean, even though it's called the Lean Startup, I mean, for example, Eric Ries's book goes into, I mean, there's a number of case studies that basically come from quite big companies, like Intuit, like GE. So, I mean, these techniques are basically about new product development, where it is they're being used isn't quite that important.
If I can take you back to that validation bit, you mentioned that experiment. I didn't quite catch it, so I'd like you to talk about that. But basically what we're saying is there that if you collect some data, if you measure something, you can then determine before that experiment starts what success and failure looks like. And once it's started, you can't kind of change that around. You just have to run the experiment and then see what happens at the end. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So because you're defining what you expect up front, then that way you know what after you've gathered the data, after you've run the experiment, you know whether or not that particular assumption is true or isn't true. And then based on that, that's basically the result of your learning. Then you've got to step back and think, well, is it I mean, if it was true, great, keep going, keep validating your other assumptions. If it wasn't, then what is true, and what other experiment can I run to figure out what actually is going on here? And having that hypothesis formulated up front is actually the really powerful part of this, I think.
Yeah, I agree. What was the experiment card again, Luke?
So the experiment card, it's basically a free download on Tricro's website, and it's just like a form that you can print out on like a sheet of paper, basically, and it's
brilliant.
It gives you all of the steps of actually formulating an experiment, and just to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's useful.
Thinking about some of those experiments, so our listeners have never heard this concept before, for instance, and they've got a business and they kind of get it. So they're thinking, all right, okay, I'd like to run some experiments in my business and validate some of the stuff. Could you give some examples, Luke, to help clarify what experiments could actually take place within an organization, please? Put you on the spot there, haven't I?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely love this topic. So, so in terms of experiments, I guess the easiest way to kind of start is usually more market facing. So for example, quite a common issue, especially in the early stages of a startup getting off the ground, is what are kind of typical customer acquisition costs. And so let's say you have a particular target profile in mind, and you need to try to figure out how it is that you can reach this type of customer at a larger scale. So you've got potentially any number of channels. So, all the, Google, Facebook, paid ways of doing it, free ways of doing it. There's many different ways. So with each channel, you basically figure out simple ways of doing something on a very small scale, just to get a sense of, is this particular channel likely to be a good source of leads for this business? And ideally, you're doing it not just completely based on your own assumptions or based on what you're good at. You're doing it based on feedback that you've gotten from customers. So, for example, you've done a number of customer interviews. A lot of the customers that you're approaching happen to be reading like a particular magazine or following a particular blog or something like that. That gives you, a strong indication that, if you go out and try and do, for example, paid advertising in that magazine, that it might be a good way to go. So in that particular case, for an experiment, you basically define up front, okay, so if I decide to pay £2,000 for an ad in this magazine, I expect to get this many hits to my website or this many signups to my mailing list. And then you go out, you actually do it, and then you find out after you run that experiment, well, did this ad actually do something for me? Did it actually move the needle in the way that I expected it to or not? And sometimes that's a yes, sometimes that's a no, but that's your learning process.
When I've used that in the past, what I've tried to do is kind of dovetail buying personas and custom avatars in there. So a great thing you mentioned was that you might want to run an ad on a blog, or you might want to do a Facebook post or whatever it is. Running that buying persona exercise helps you understand what your customer looks like, and where they hang out, really. So it can help shape where your ad sits, where your blog article will be posted to, whether that be LinkedIn or some trade specific article. So do you guys use those at all?
So with buyer personas, I mean, certainly having a more specific buyer persona is a really important step. I mean, I think a really good way to do test around this is, once you're done your interviews, is to focus on actual behavior via landing pages. So basically, I mean, interviews, people will tell you lots of things, and a lot of them are useful, especially if you're just starting out. But then if you want to see what people are actually willing to buy, willing to pay for, it's much better to create, a simulated environment where they're purchasing or actually pre-selling something, to figure out whether or not, somebody actually is a buyer. So is there actual demand? Is there actual real money behind something? And in that case, it can be as simple as you set up a web page that describes the product or service, and you buy paid advertising, and then that gives you a very clear indication of, are people buying it outright? I mean, if it's really a great idea, if it's really a great fit, people will be buying it outright, or are they not? Or if you don't want to go that far, you could just be trying to first just set up a landing page and trying to get, for example, connection details like emails or phone numbers or something, and then using that to drive an interview process. But at least you're doing it based on actual behavior. So people who are actually raising their hand saying, I'm interested in this and I'm willing to do something about it, and not just, somebody telling you, oh, that's a good idea.
What I like about that is, thinking about an established business, this would let you allocate resources more effectively, won't it? So, if you're kind of on the hamster wheel and an organization is doing something a certain way, just maybe stepping off that wheel for a moment and just thinking about things a little bit differently might help. So do you see any objections sometimes to established businesses where you say, look, stop, let's validate? Do they say that, I'm too busy for that, I haven't got the resources for that? Do you face those kind of objections?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of variations of that. I think it ultimately comes down to a trade-off of, are you okay with accepting the risk that you might be spending, a year, 2 years, and, in some cases millions of pounds building something that ends up not really being useful to anybody, versus spending, a week or something doing some validation. So basically getting, having some discussions with the market and possibly doing a landing page test or two to be able to, test certain aspects of it, just to see if there actually is some kind of real response. I mean, in terms of the actual responses that I get with companies, certainly bigger companies, with landing page tests specifically, would be, I think there's concern from a PR standpoint sometimes that you're kind of showing your cards to some extent, and that they want, for example, that they want to do a whole entire launch process, which takes quite a while to organize. So they don't want to be just showing what they have. And then there's very specific ways around that. So for example, you can do a landing page test in such a way that you do it off brand. So basically you do the test, but you don't identify it with the company that's doing it. You're setting up an environment just like a psychology research laboratory. You're just trying to figure out, if if 200 people come to this landing page of the kind that you want, like what percent are actually going to be engaging with it? But at the same time, it doesn't need to actually be identified with your particular company. So that way you get the data, you keep it very small scale, and you get the learning, which then drives, well, do we actually then go and build it, or do we not?
So that would really help them. I guess some of these larger companies might be worried about the competition and trying to get there faster. So I think that's a perfect way to actually test and learn with a view to actually getting there faster. So, let's not run all the way down that road and have to unwind in a year or two's time and 2 million quid, 5-10 million quid. It's do that testing up front, and that will help you quicker when you actually have validated and you've got that data in 2 weeks' time to then look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this comes down to getting kind of doing this whole testing process iteratively. So initially, if you have an idea, you give a little bit of time and a little bit of money. If it seems like a good idea, once you've done that, then you can build something small and give it a little bit more time, get more feedback. Then if you're still getting positive signals from the market, you're still getting a strong pull from the market, then you keep investing in it. And if you don't, you basically kill it at that stage, just to limit your losses.
Just thinking about those large companies again, my mind was spinning a little bit. So I was lucky enough to spend some time with Alex and Eve that we've mentioned from Strategizer there. And I know those guys work on the culture map as well. So do you use that within your work? So when you are working with some of these large companies, do you bring that tool in?
With the culture map, I've found it interesting. I've found it difficult to apply in a company. Okay. Coming in, I mean, I think the other tools they have, certainly the value prop canvas, the business model canvas, they're much better at kind of mapping out current state, ideal target state, more the mechanics of the actual, let's say, innovation process and the prototyping of the business models. In terms of using the culture map to map internal processes, I mean, certainly culture is hugely important. There's no question about that. I've found the culture map to be, I think in some cases, almost asking for too much self-awareness in a company, and sometimes they aren't always ready for it. I mean, maybe it's just because I haven't been able to actually do it, kind of turn it into something useful within a company, me specifically. But I've just found it not quite as useful as some of the other stuff that they've created.
No, I really value your opinion on that, because I think sometimes when you try and introduce some of these tools and projects, I think sometimes the culture isn't ready for it just then. And I was just wondering whether you did a little bit of work up front from a culture point of view to get them in that space of thinking of more modern tools, more iterative processes, more flexible kind of processes, the agile side of it, rather than maybe that culture was quite stiff and corporate and not really up to speed just yet. So no, I haven't actually implemented the map itself, but I think more elements of it, if you know what I mean. Yeah,
I mean, what's on it is certainly kind of really important in terms of where you should pay your attention, the actual behaviors you're seeing, what's actually being rewarded, what's being punished within a company. I mean, that kind of defines the culture. I mean, if you look at things like, the last handful of people who've been promoted, that gives you a pretty strong indication of what the culture actually is, and not like the list of values they have hanging up on the wall. Which, and sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. But I mean, in that sense, I think the concepts are quite good in the culture map, but just the tool itself, I think it's still, I mean, as far as I know, they've already iterated it a couple of times, and I think it's still not quite at the level where it's really doing as much as like the business model canvas does.
Yeah, you're right. They have actually. They've stripped it right back and tried to simplify it, a lot than it was. It was a bit too deep. So no, that's really interesting. So you said something really interesting. You said to kill it. So we're talking there on pivoting or persevering. So what's it like to kill a project? Is it super hard for someone who's passionate about that and romantic about it to do? Or is it something that you just think, well, we've tested it, doesn't work, move on?
It's definitely super hard. I mean, so this kind of goes back to like the whole with pivots. I mean, the word pivot, at least in a lean startup context, has a very specific meaning. So you're only really pivoting if you've gathered data to disprove a specific assumption that you have that shows that something is wrong. So it isn't just changing, it's changing because you have data to show that your current direction doesn't make sense. So it's still emotionally super heart-wrenching, especially, if you're a founder, you're going in a particular direction and it just turns out, this just isn't going to happen in this particular way. But, that being said, I mean, if you look at quite a large number, certainly within the technology industry, quite a large number of the really big companies in tech, their original seed of an idea which they started with ended up being very different with what they do nowadays. Twitter originally started out as like a podcasting type service before podcasts even existed. I'm just trying to think. Most, like off the top of my head, Google's first name was originally something like Backrub, but I mean it actually was a search kind of thing, but it was completely quite different from what it originally was. I mean there was quite a number of significant changes relative to kind of original directions for a lot of these big companies, and I think a lot of the reason, I think, for their success is that they were capable of dealing with the fact that they needed to change direction when they needed to change direction. And they actually did manage to do that successfully.
Yeah, I'm glad you sort of backed that up when you mentioned it was heart-wrenching, because it is. I've been there. So thinking about some of the listeners we might have who could think they're in a place where it's not quite working, what could they do, Luke? How could they test and just sort of, rather than pull the plug and wonder, should I have really pulled it and could I have made it work? What could they do to really validate that yes, you should kill it?
If you're consistently doing tests, you're gathering a lot of data along the way, so that tends to tell you early on that some part of your vision needs to be changed. If you're at a point where, let's say, for example, you haven't really been following this kind of an approach, I mean, the first place I would probably start is just going back. It depends on so many factors, but just going back and doing some customer interviews and then using that as your primary source of, let's say, data, even if it's qualitative data, to decide whether or not this makes sense. So does the problem actually exist in these customers' minds? If it does, is what's been created so far, is that the best possible way of addressing that particular pain point? And sometimes if you've done enough customer interaction before, that's fine, and then you go through and then you can keep checking other things. But I mean, sometimes it turns out, I mean, I've had situations where somebody did already come to me with like a product already developed, and when they actually went back and kind of did this more customer focused approach, it turned out that they did need to change, and a lot of what they'd already created actually wasn't that helpful, and they ended up reusing some of that experience, some of that code, but not anywhere nearly as much as they'd initially hoped. But I mean, all the power to them that they actually had the courage to be able to do that and to go ahead despite, the relatively clear signals from the market that they were just going too wide and trying to do too much for too many people, and as a result, not really satisfying anybody.
So we're saying that failure could be avoided if we just put these things in place before it's too late, before we burnt all the capital and the cash flow that's there.
So I think the earlier you do it, the better. I mean, it's the kind of thing where if you don't front load it and you don't do it up front, you're going to eventually need to do it in some form, if nothing else, when you actually launch the product that you're working on. But at that point, it could be that you absolutely nail it, or it could be that at that point you kind of get all of those learnings you should have had all in one moment. So if you do start earlier and you do more of this earlier, it's just much easier to change direction and adjust to what it is that you're learning the earlier you do it. And you have more money and you have more flexibility in terms of what it is that you're creating. So you can take it a number of different ways at that point.
Brilliant. So Luke, if somebody wanted to know more about this, where would you suggest they start?
So there's a couple of things. So first of all, there's a community work called the Startup Real Book, which is basically a collection of 50, 60 different types of experiments that you can run on to help figure out things related to either the market side or the product side of building and creating a new product. That's one option. Another option is an ebook that I'm working on at the moment. It's called Your First Startup Experiment, which is taking it from this initial point where you have a germ of an idea and possibly a business model canvas, and figuring out how do I actually formulate an experiment and what's worth testing. So that's another possible angle. And I think between those two resources, I think that's definitely a good place to start.
See, the Startup Real Book, that's open source, so anybody can get that, is it, Luke?
Yes, so it's totally open source. There's a number of contributors there. You're free to use it. You're free to use it for your own work in. It's just there. It's meant to be there as a resource to help people do this, apply this, and have a specific. First of all, knowing what's possible, because there's a lot of ideas that are out there kind of floating around, but kind of having it all in one place makes it a lot easier to at least figure out, basically have a menu of what kinds of tests can I run and what can I learn, as opposed to, just having this vague sense of I need to run an experiment. So that makes it a bit more concrete. And I think that's the main goal of that book. But then there's also the aspect of, in my particular case, what do I do first? I mean, even though you have a whole bunch of these possible experiment types, or you can obviously do variations of them too. In my particular case, what do I test first? And the short answer there is that you need to identify the riskiest assumption, and then construct experiments around that, and then that helps you learn what you need to learn the most right at the beginning. And so that's kind of the idea behind Your First Startup Experiment.
Brilliant. Well, what we'll do is on the show notes, Luke, we'll put some links out there. So I think, things like the Startup Real Book with some real world examples in there, it's going to give you a starter for 10 rather than just have the experiment card from Tricos that you mentioned and kind of staring at a blank canvas. So at least you've got an idea of what the possible is. So we'll definitely link out to those. Thanks for your time, Luke. It's been really great, and we'll speak to you soon. Thanks very much, Luke. That was Luke Szyrmer there, introducing you to the lean startup concept. Luke lives and breathes this stuff, and he also organises the Lean Startup Circle in London. I have got links to everything Luke mentioned today, lots of resources for you, such as the First Startup Experiment, the Real Startup Book, Experiment Templates, and also his book, Launch Tomorrow, about using a landing page to launch your own lean startup in one day. As always, let me know how you found this episode, host@industryangel.com. Remember to keep in touch, keep sharing the show, doing what you're doing, loving who you're loving, chilling where you're chilling. I can't think of anything else to do. Love and chill. What more do you need? Until next time, I'm Ian Farrer. This is the Industry Angel. Thanks for listening.